You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 11th of December 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme, violence and insecurity intensify in Haiti. We'll have analysis of the widening crisis. Then Chris Chermak, our senior news editor, joins us. Chris, what's happening in Germany?
Georgina, the moment has finally arrived. Chancellor Olaf Scholz is requesting a vote of no confidence in his government, ushering in fresh elections.
Thank you, Chris. Plus, remember this? The chainsaw-wielding former rock musician Javier Milei has been president of Argentina for a year now. We'll ask if he's delivered on his election promises. We'll have a roundup of news from the United Arab Emirates. And finally, is Donald Trump really planning to annex Canada? We'll find out about that and more right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. After years of political and economic turmoil, violence in Haiti has escalated to crisis levels. More than 3,600 people were killed in the first half of 2024, and an estimated 700,000 have been displaced as gang violence surges in Port-au-Prince and surrounding areas, while Haiti's health system struggles under the weight of a nationwide humanitarian crisis. Dr. Christopher Sabitini is a senior fellow for Latin America at Chatham House, and he's on the line with more. Chris, welcome back to the show. What is the genesis of this crisis?
Well, it's long-standing. Haiti has been in turmoil now for decades. Politics is a zero-sum game, and oftentimes politicians or those in power ally themselves with gangs to promote sort of a form of both mobilizing support as well as street justice. And this goes actually all the way back to the Duvalier regime, which ended in 1986, but of course increased with the successive series of presidents and military governments. And just recently, earlier in 2022, the president was assassinated, Jovenel Moise. And then basically there was a coup that removed him through these gangs. And now we're stuck in a situation where gangs control over 80% of the capital city. They've suspended flights into the airport because a number of American Airlines has indefinitely suspended those flights because of shooting at planes. It has become truly a failed state, but also a state that's increasingly being run by criminals.
And how did those criminals gain such control?
Part of it is again, just the dysfunction of the political system and the alliances that have, again, been historic between politicians and criminal elements, but also the sale of guns in the United States, which are very easy to buy, and then their shipment to Haiti has increased their access to weapons to be able to enforce their authority, as well as drug trafficking. Haiti is a major transshipment point for drugs to the United States and also to Europe. So this has provided them with effectively what is necessary to be a state: guns and money. And they've been able to take over already a weak state, a weak government, and impose their own authority.
So extreme poverty is another issue, and lack of clean water. I wonder how this is impacting on health.
It's right now about half of the population is food insecure. There's outbreak of the cholera. It is a tragic situation. More than, as you mentioned, more than 700,000 Haitians have been displaced. A lot of them also leaving the country, trying to flee to their neighboring country, the Dominican Republic, but they're being shipped back. At the same time, the problem is that within the United Nations, the Security Council in October last year approved a multinational security support force or mission, but that didn't really have any UN authority. It was based on voluntary contributions. The Kenyans stepped up and agreed to send police, about 1,000 police. Only about 400 have been sent, and many are now defecting because they're not getting paid. At the time, it was estimated that the mission would cost about $600 million. They've only raised $85 million, so it's severely short-funded. And the Chinese and the Russians and the UN Security Council are blocking any efforts to step this up to being a UN peacekeeping mission, which is what is really necessary. So there's also the failure on the international community in this.
What else is or should be being done to help the country?
I think the first is again, some UN resolution that doesn't depend on voluntary contributions, that establishes some security force, that establishes with real resources. A police force from Kenya, and I appreciate their valor in taking this on, is not going to be sufficient. These gangs are armed to the teeth. And they are brutal, as we saw from the bloodletting that occurred this weekend, where close to 200 people were killed, including 110 older people, practitioners of voodoo, because one gang leader believed they had cast a spell that led to his son's death. So they are running amok. Their entire neighborhoods that are off limits for the security forces. It's going to take much more than what the international community is committed to do. And unfortunately, Haitians themselves, the common refrain has been that this is a problem that Haitians should resolve themselves. But the truth is a transitional council has been sort of basically paralyzed with indecision, and they've sacked their own provisional prime minister and appointed someone else. It's just completely dysfunctional internally at this point. It requires a very serious commitment internationally.
You mentioned that people are fleeing to the Dominican Republic, and of course Haiti and the Dominican Republic share the island of Hispaniola. How have they gone from this shared location to such different outcomes? Why is Dominican Republic so much better off?
Well, that's a very good question. It's one scholars have struggled with for a long time. I think the first is basically Haiti became independent before the Dominican Republic from France, and France levied an entirely disproportionate, unjust fee for its price for its independence that it was still paying off until recently, until the 20th century. So first of all, they started with a huge debt burden. The Civil War, the revolution that freed them, also destroyed much of the country. And then you also have the problems of basically they live in an island that has been completely denuded because of the poverty. If you fly over Hispaniola, you can see clearly the demarcation lines, the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. On the Haiti side, it's all brown dirt. Much of it has been denuded for firewood. And on the Dominican Republic side, it's green. And that has led to really tragic consequences when hurricanes and floods sweep through the island. It just leads to mudslides and further destruction of infrastructure.
So does France bear a lot of responsibility for this? Or rather, France does bear responsibility for this. But is there any chance that they'll pay reparations or, in fact, step up and try and help the country that they left in such dire straits?
It's a good question, Georgina. And they should, but they aren't. I think, first of all, as we see now, they're consumed by their own internal problems. But yes, really a large share of the responsibility of Haiti getting a slow and crippled start right out of the blocks is because of France. And again, the United States and the UN have been trying to raise money for this mission. And France has not even paid back a portion of what it was paid because of the loans it leveled against Haiti.
How do you see the future for the country?
I think this is something we're actually working on right now at Chatham House, trying to generate more attention. I think it's going to take a real effort by the international community, by the United States even. Now, I know this will be difficult under the Trump administration, which has a certain distrust, obviously, in international foreign engagements and also multilateral institutions. The one thing I think is having Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, who will likely be confirmed as Secretary of State. He has a real stake in this because a lot of the Haitians who are fleeing go to Florida. So he may actually invest, I hope, some political capital in trying to get some movement and some resources to put in place both a multilateral force as well as some real funding on this. But it's going to take neighboring countries, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and others to contribute. And they've really also failed in that mission.
And as you say, of course, the administration's about to change. We shouldn't forget that it was J.D. Vance and Donald Trump that promoted the idea that Haitians were eating cats and dogs.
There's that too. And yes, so they actually, again, to that point, I'm not sure they're, given their rhetoric and their position on foreign affairs, I'm not sure they're willing to commit to what's called a root strategy in terms of stemming migration, which is improve the conditions in the sending countries. But in this case, they obviously have to. And they've talked about sending back a lot of those migrants that were falsely accused of eating cats and dogs from Springfield, Ohio, who, by the way, were not undocumented immigrants. They had actually been given refugee status. So they are going to be caught in between a difficult position here is what are they going to do over what was an unfortunate and very ugly trope in their campaign about the situation in Haiti.
Chris, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Georgina.
That was Chris Sabitini from Chatham House. And if you'd like to hear more about the human side of the Haiti story, do listen to the best-selling author Mitch Albom as he talks about adopting a Haitian orphan on an archived edition of Meet the Writers. Now, here's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. Mohamed al-Bashir, Syria's new interim prime minister, has vowed to bring back millions of Syrian refugees and provide basic services for all citizens. Al-Bashir has been tasked with leading the new transitional government until March 2025 and has said that people should enjoy stability and calm after the overthrow of President Bashar al-Assad. The US said it would recognize a future Syrian government as long as it emerged from a credible, inclusive process that respected minorities. Authorities in South Korea have attempted to search President Yoon Suk-yeol's office in a move that signals an escalation into the investigation against him and key leaders in the police and military. It comes as a result of the constitutional crisis prompted by his decision last week to declare martial law. Investigators are in the presidential compound but have not been able to enter the main building. And Europeans are taking more flights outside the EU than they do within the continent. The new report by the governmental agency Eurostat shows that in the last year, 49% of passengers chose to travel to countries outside of the bloc. The data also shows that Paris Charles de Gaulle is European Union's busiest airport, servicing 67 million passengers last year, followed by Amsterdam's Schiphol and Madrid's Barajas. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Carlotta. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is submitting a request to Parliament today to hold a vote of confidence, the necessary precursor to holding new federal elections after the collapse of his coalition last month. Scholz is expected to lose the vote, which is slated for December the 16th, as his government no longer has a majority. He must then request the president to dissolve Parliament, triggering new elections. Chris, walk us through this quite long process.
Well, it is quite a long process, even if it is sort of this official part of it. As you say, once the government collapsed, the three-party coalition government that Scholz had collapsed, it was clear that this was going to happen, and all that we had was a wrangling around the dates for when this vote of no confidence would happen and when elections would happen. So now we're entering this process. Scholz is formally writing today that he, wants to have a vote of no confidence in his government. After that happens on Monday, it would go to the president of Germany, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He has to then basically declare that, there is no other party that has the confidence of the parliament, and therefore new elections have to be triggered within 60 days. All of this is a bit of a weird sort of timing because there's been this outside wrangling, so that means that Steinmeier has to only declare this at the end of the year so that the actual date of the election, which has already been set, 23rd of February, can happen within the 60 days. So all of this is just kind of a weird bit of a formality just to get to this final day that we are all already expecting, and all the campaigns are basically gearing up for, the 23rd of February.
Yeah. So, when this happens then, who's going to take over? What are the positions of the various parties now?
Well, that's a good question. Clearly, in terms of the elections so far, it is the Christian Democrats that are very clearly in the lead under opposition leader Friedrich Merz. He is very much the sort of anti-Angela Merkel, if you will. He was always a rival to Angela Merkel before he basically left government at the time that Angela Merkel was in office. So on the one hand, he is, a return to the Christian Democrats of the past, but he's a very pro-business candidate. He's been very strong and aggressive on Ukraine. That's something we've talked about on this show as well, because he was visiting Ukraine as well earlier. And this is one of the areas where he's kind of staked out a claim for himself compared to Olaf Scholz, who is talking about himself as the kind of man of peace, if you will, compared to Friedrich Merz. But he's the one that's really expected to win all of this. He's also staked a very aggressive claim on immigration. So he moves further to the right, certainly compared to Angela Merkel's party. He's also made this claim very clearly when it comes to Syria and the repatriation of Syrians, and others potentially also stopping new immigrants from arriving at the German border. So he is quite to the far right, I would say, of the conservatives, of the Christian Democrats.
Chris, just quickly before you go, I mean, this comes just 10 days after Prime Minister Michel Barnier lost a no-confidence vote in France. You're looking at the two of the European powerhouses suddenly having huge political instability. What does this mean for the future of the Union?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I do think there's a difference between France and Germany in the sense that, if you look at France right now, we're really talking political deadlock and instability. In the case of Germany, yes, the government collapsed. It was a three-party experimental coalition government between sort of two left-leaning and one right-leaning party. So it was never going to necessarily last the entire term. So yes, it has collapsed. But this is a little bit more part of the normal democratic process, I would argue, in Germany. I don't think there's a sense, at least politically, that Germany is unstable at the moment. There's just going to be a shift back to the right, most likely. That's what we can expect, although who the Christian Democrats are in coalition with will remain a question based on how the results come out of the vote. The instability in Germany comes more on the economic side. That's the part where the big worry is Germany is losing its influence because its economy is struggling. That's something that'll be up to Christian Merz to try and figure out once he potentially enters office.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. That's Chris Chermak there. And this is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing. Now, yesterday marked a year in office for Javier Milei, the colourful and controversial president of Argentina. He was elected on a promise of delivering sweeping change and a return to the classical liberalism that made the Latin American nation one of the richest countries in the world a century ago. Amy Booth, who's managing editor of the Buenos Aires Herald, joins us now. Amy, thanks for coming on the show. What was the state of the country when Milei inherited it?
Honestly, Argentina was at a really complicated and difficult moment. We were seeing inflation that was, well into three figures. It peaked shortly after he took office at around 270, 280%. There were also, there was a lot of social discontent with the situation because we were seeing, despite the fact that at one point the economy was growing, poverty was also rising, right, which is quite surprising because of this runaway inflation. And there was a sensation clearly among the people that they couldn't take anymore and they wanted a radical change.
And so what did he promise and has he delivered?
So he essentially promised that he was going to do away with Peronism's mode of government, which is a very sort of pro-big state movement involving a lot of state support, a lot of state welfare, and that he was going to move towards a sort of almost neoliberal free market fundamentalism, if you will, in the sense that he was promising to slash the state back to a bare minimum. He was promising that that people would be free to do business as they please. He promised to dollarize the economy as well. And he, on the more social side of things, he promised to put an end to sort of street protests and street picket lines and move towards this sort of what he would call an ordered free market society.
And has he done it?
So interestingly, he's actually delivered on a lot of his promises in a way that I think people have found quite surprising. So, I mean, he was vowing to get rid of inflation and he's actually been pretty successful at that. So the last monthly inflation statistic that we have, we're going to get another one this afternoon, but in October, inflation was down to 2.7%. And I know that might sound like a lot in the UK. This was in a month, by the way, 2.7% in a month. And that was actually the lowest that we'd had in about 3 years because, that's compared with 25.5% in December of last year, at a time when, he devalued the currency and there was a lot of uncertainty. So people have been, people are glad that inflation has come down in a sense, but they've also started to it's been displaced as their top concern by things like poor job quality and poverty, because poverty has also risen a lot as a corollary of this. And yeah, I mean, he's also, street protest there are no longer as many marches through the streets of central Buenos Aires as there were, partly because his security minister, Patricia Bullrich, has implemented these pretty draconian measures and threats saying that, this is not going to be allowed anymore. But we have to say that there've also been some protests that have been cracked down on quite violently. And, there's a lot of concern that people, because obviously protesting is a right and it's a right that's not always being respected. So I would say that he has delivered on a number of these promises, some like leaving capital controls and dollarizing the economy have not been done. But I think that's what he was promising, or that's what he was claiming he's going to work on in 2025 in his first year anniversary speech last night.
Before he took office, there was concern about some of his wilder behaviour, wielding a chainsaw, talking about communicating with his dead dogs, calling Pope Francis a communist turd and so on. Has that kind of behaviour continued? I
mean, I think we can kind of divide this into two categories in the sense that some of the things that he had said. So he's a guy that came up and surged to the national limelight as a TV pundit, right? And so people making these outlandish statements tends to make for great TV. And so he'd said things like, that the sale of human organs was a market like any other, that like if people wanted to starve to death, then they were free to do so, or that like, if people were hungry, they would just find themselves having to go out and find some work. And so obviously that generated a lot of shock. But I mean, he wasn't saying this in terms of genuinely meaning that he was going to attempt to legalize human organ sales. I think some of these were more discursive and more rhetorical. However, other aspects, as you correctly said, of his leadership style and of his discursive style have in fact remained. So we've seen that, for example, he has made no bones about saying some fairly outlandish things towards other world leaders. Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, he's called a murderous communist a couple of times. Spain, he was speaking at a far-right event in Spain and said or implied that the first lady was corrupt, which led to them recalling each other's ambassadors. So, we have seen that some of that has continued, but I think we've also seen a move towards pragmatism in the sense that, because he stands at the opposite ideological end of the spectrum from neighboring Brazil's Lula da Silva, for example. But they did finally reluctantly meet at, I think, the G20 summit a couple of weeks back. And there was a picture of them taken together. It turned into a meme because they both look very unhappy to be there, but they did meet. And he's also been sort of starting to become more open towards China after having written them off as communists before. So I think, in some senses, some of this kind of firebrand rhetoric has proved, it has continued, but some of it was discursive more than action.
Amy, thank you very much indeed. That's Amy Booth there. And this is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio, and I'm joined now by Mustafa Al-Rawi, who's a journalist and a writer based in the UAE. Mustafa, many thanks for joining us. Dubai is set to follow in the footsteps of Paris and New York to create a pedestrian-friendly city. Tell us more.
Hi, Georgina. Thanks. Yes, Dubai has announced that it's going to create sort of pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods within the city to make people's lives a little bit less sort of disrupted by the increasing traffic that people are experiencing in the city. And there's been various options that they think in the future will help, such as electric flying taxis and other solutions. But this one is more about posture and sort of what kind of city do they want Dubai to be. And there's this sort of philosophy around a 20-minute city that you can do everything 20 minutes around your home. And this is what they want to build. It's very ambitious. And, anyone who's been to Dubai will know that, it's a very car-heavy city.
Let's turn to Abu Dhabi now and Finance Week, which opened yesterday. What was that all about?
Well, I have to say I was there myself at Abu Dhabi Finance Week over the last couple of days, and the energy is quite crazy. There is a huge volume of financial professionals, technology professionals in the crypto space, in fintech, bankers, and leaders as well. David Cameron, the former UK Prime Minister, was speaking today about digital economy. We had various CEOs of big banks, big announcements, and it feels like there's sort of a gravity happening in the UAE capital around finance and money and fintech, and that it could be emerging as a real kind of alternative to London, New York, Frankfurt, some of these more traditional financial powerhouses.
Let's go back to talking about cars, because of course F1 has been on and there's been an announcement that McLaren is going to be bought by an Abu Dhabi company.
So McLaren has been owned by a Bahraini sovereign wealth fund for a number of years now, going back more than a decade. And an Abu Dhabi company called CYVN, which is in the mobility space, is going to buy its automotive business, McLaren's cars, essentially the very expensive, very fast, funky looking vehicles that sometimes you see on the roads, because Abu Dhabi is making a big play in terms of the future of mobility, whether it's electric cars, self-driving cars, or otherwise. So they need that expertise, they need that technology, and McLaren, which has the F1 pedigree, that sort of British innovation in the car industry over many decades, particularly high performance, that's something that needs to be bought in. And so that this will really help advance Abu Dhabi's leadership role in terms of mobility going forward.
Mustafa, thank you very much indeed. It's Mustafa Al-Rawi, a journalist and writer based in the UAE. And finally on today's show, US President-elect Donald Trump continues to belittle and poke fun at fellow politicians. This time it's Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, whom he referred to as Governor of the great state of Canada, and jokingly suggested that his country become the 51st state of the US. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Natasha Lindstad, who's Professor of Government at the University of Essex. Natasha, we say he's joking, but could anything happen?
Well, Trump uses this approach of just sort of aggressively joking to basically destabilize a negotiating partner. And that's what Justin Trudeau has said, that Trump's approach is to constantly challenge people, to often offer uncertainty, a bit of chaos. And that's what he does to make people feel, that they're on their toes, that they don't know what to expect. So supposedly he brought up this idea, Trump brought up the idea that Canada would be the 51st state during the first administration over a dozen times to make the Canadians feel incredibly anxious. And so this is just all part of his negotiation strategy. But Trudeau has already acknowledged to the Canadian people that the second Trump administration is likely to be a lot more challenging than the first one was.
What's the root of the Trump-Trudeau trouble?
So Trump would argue that this is due to an unfair trade agreement. The U.S. and Canada are each other's largest trading partners. They do over $900 billion in trade with one another. And there have been ups and downs in the trading relationship. There have been moments that there were disagreements over trade, and this predated Trump, over dairy products or cattle or soft lumber or cars. So there were tensions in the past. But for the most part, the relationship between the U.S. and Canada has been incredibly strong. Trump is worried that there is somehow fentanyl coming in from Canada, or that there are immigrants coming from Canada illegally. I mean, it's a very, very low numbers according to border officials. But I think it is also very personal. Trump is very jealous of Trudeau. Trump's White House communication director mentioned that Trump was jealous that Trudeau is younger and better looking, and Melania, his wife, had gained, attention for the fact that she was really flirting with Trudeau one time. So I don't know to what extent this is personal or this is based on political issues.
I mean, Natasha, is Trump trolling us all? He seems to make one ludicrous pronouncement after another. The appointment of various ambassadors to countries, some of the people he's put up for state position, and his use particularly of that photograph of Jill Biden and him at Notre Dame. Can you tell us how he used that Biden photograph?
So he just tries to use visuals to get attention. I mean, this is all about mobilizing his base by using very crude and aggressive imagery that he is ever powerful, and that everybody around him, he demeans them, he minimizes them, he relishes poking at his opponents. And this is all to the delight of his supporters. They love his irreverent comments. And every time he posts one of these memes, they are widely shared online, and they are, cheered for by his supporters. So this is all something that I think he just loves the attention of being able to demean and belittle others.
So, of course, as we know, Jill Biden looked at him quite fondly. It could have been a great opportunity for resetting the relationship, perhaps some kind of unity. Instead, he used it as an advert for his own fragrance. Apparently, there is a Trump perfume. It's called Fight, Fight, Fight. Any idea what that might smell like, Natasha?
I have no idea, and I have no plans on learning what it smells like. I mean, he just hawks everything from watches to Bibles, and now this crazy perfume or cologne or whatever. It's just crazy, and it's a violation, really, of the Emoluments Clause. I mean, there's obviously clear ethical issues with the way he's used the presidency to enrich himself and to sell one thing after another. That his supporters are willing to buy. So, I mean, this is all part of the commercialization of the presidency at levels that we'd never seen before.
Natasha Lindstedt, thank you very much indeed. Well, if I had to hazard a guess about what Fight, Fight, Fight smells like, I would say it would have strong undertones of musk. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riotta and Hassan Anderson. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid and Maisie Ringer. And our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing's back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye and thanks for listening.